Critical ambush from the Ukrainian army. After this move of the Ukrainian army, Russian soldiers raised a white flag. However, the soldiers in the Russian army were completely cornered. If Ukraine continues in this way, the probability of winning the war would increase. The impact of a very different country in this ambush was quite large. The confessions of the soldiers who were captured by the Ukrainian army resonated all over the world. In the last days of the Ukraine-Russia war, the Ukrainian army was making many different breakthroughs. However, the United States and European countries have also begun to provide very serious support to the Ukrainian army. In particular, the training and support provided by the United States enabled the strengthening of the Ukrainian intelligence network. After these trainings, the Ukrainian army cornered the Russian soldiers. After such a development of the Ukrainian intelligence network, the Ukrainian army had begun to strike very big blows. However, the Ukrainian intelligence network first mobilized the flag officers in order to conduct reconnaissance in the region. Thus, the Ukrainian army would detect possible attacks and prevent them. These steps taken by the Ukrainian army were putting Russian soldiers in a difficult situation. And agents from the Russian army told the Ukrainian army that Russia would conduct an operation on Soledar. Thus, the Russian soldiers who went to Soledar were faced with a sight they never expected. Soldiers from the Ukrainian army were blown up in a wooded area in the area. The Russian troops coming to the Soledar region were expected to pass through this region. The Ukrainian army has completed its preparations after determining which route the Russian troops will use, and he took action to strike a big blow to the Russian army. The Ukrainian army was now organizing larger operations, cornering the Russian soldiers. The Russian soldiers who entered the region were deployed first, and then all the soldiers in the Russian army began to move. But there was a problem for Ukraine. The equipment brought by the Ukrainian army to this region could not be used against heavy armored vehicles. However, the Ukrainian army was doing everything in its power to corner the Russian soldiers despite all the negativities, and the Ukrainian soldiers took a step that will go down in history, narrowing this forest to the Russian army. The armored vehicles used by the Russian army in the Soledar region were very robust. But the Ukrainian army contacted the center and supplied armor-piercing rocket launchers to the region. Thus, the Ukrainian army would plan a strategic move and move to corner the Russian soldiers. After that, when the Ukrainian observation troops saw that the Russian army was approaching the area, preparations were immediately started. Taking advantage of the first light of the morning, the Ukrainian army made a very critical move as Russian soldiers passed through the area. The coup of the Ukrainian army against the Russian soldiers caused great repercussions all over the world. Russian soldiers were advancing to the Soledar region with their armored vehicles when they encountered a surprise attack. However, the first rocket launchers sent by the Ukrainian army caused very serious damage to the Russian troops. At the same time, the Ukrainian army had spread all over the region, anticipating that the Russians would come prepared. Russian soldiers, on the other hand, were deployed against rocket launchers to use the opportunities at their disposal. However, this move of the Russian soldiers would not have worked because the Ukrainian army had blockaded the area. The Russian soldiers, who soon became aware of this situation, were puzzled what to do, and they took action to leave the area. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, was continuing its attacks without slowing down. The Russian soldiers were trying to leave the area without looking back. This defeat of the Russian army immediately reached the Kremlin. Hearing about what happened, Putin went berserk with anger. When Putin could not bear this defeat for himself, he claimed that the only reason for the superiority of the Ukrainian army in this region was the support from the West. Hearing this, the Ukrainian army moved to carry out a very critical operation. He began to threaten countries that support Russian President Vladimir Putin's Ukrainian army. Putin even went too far and started making threats, even with nuclear weapons. This is Putin's move that has complicated things. Many countries that are pro-peace have taken action. At the same time, many countries have started to increase their support to the Ukrainian army even more. But despite these supports, Putin continued to exhibit aggressive and unstable attitudes. That is why many countries have taken action to impose embargoes on Russia. However, Putin continued to organize operations because he believed that he would win the war. But the Ukrainian army has achieved great victories against these operations. The Russian army, on the other hand, has not been able to achieve any success for a very long time. The Ukrainian army, on the other hand, continued to add strength to its strength with incoming supports. Putin and the Russian army have fallen into a very difficult situation. The Russian people and Russian soldiers were also affected by the embargoes on Russia, and Putin had to take a step back after these embargoes, and he may have to take even more of a step back. After the threats made by Putin, the G7 countries decided to hold an urgent meeting. Very critical decisions were made at this meeting. The G7 countries have decided to increase their support to Ukraine. However, they decided to impose major sanctions inside Russia. After these events, a statement came from Japan that will surprise the whole world. Japan has brought its support to the Ukrainian army to a completely different point. Japan had provided 550 million financial support to the Ukrainian army at the beginning of the war as part of humanitarian aid, and he had repeatedly stated that he was neutral. But after Putin's threats, Japan announced that it had increased this support exactly 11 times. The whole world was surprised by this decision and received great attention in the world press. After these developments, the Ukrainian army has added another one to the advantages it has gained. The Ukrainian army would now organize operations aimed at ending the war. Thus, the already powerless Russian army would be completely cornered. After these events, the comments made by war analysts resonated all over the world. After the comments made by war analysts, estimates began to increase about how big an operation the Ukrainian army could carry out to repel the Russians. According to the comments of war analysts, almost all the support to the Ukrainian army so far has been for strengthening the defense of the Ukrainian army. But after these recent developments, the nature of the support provided to the Ukrainian army has completely changed. Now the equipment and ammunition sent to the Ukrainian army were for the Ukrainian soldiers to win the war. Thanks to these aids, the Ukrainian army has started to add strength to its strength and corner the Russian soldiers. After that, the Ukrainian army was expected to conduct an operation to end the war. Although Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly ordered operations against the Ukrainian army in order to win the war, he has not achieved any success. And the Russian soldiers no longer had the strength to endure. Even after the recent events, Russian soldiers had become unable to shelter in the region. The Russian army has lost a lot of soldiers since the beginning of the war. Putin had made a big mobilization decision to replace these losses, but despite this, the Russian army was still weak and unsuccessful. At the same time, the mental health of the soldiers in the Russian army was getting a little worse every day. The Russian soldiers were now trying to escape the battle at the slightest opportunity, as they were beginning to think that they were fighting in vain. The Ukrainian army, which turned these mix-ups into an advantage, has now started to take more firm steps. However, the confusion in the Russian army was growing a little more every day, and both the Russian soldiers and the Russian people had begun to revolt after these defeats. Putin managed to suppress these uprisings in a short period of time, but Putin was aware that if he lost this war, both his political career and his power would come to an end.